Hi, welcome to another edition of Easy Theory. So today we're going to be showing that deterministic context-free languages are closed under complement. We saw that normal context-free languages were not closed under complement, and so this result, if we can show it, will tell us that the deterministic context-free languages are not the same thing as the context-free ones, because the normal ones are not closed under complement, but these deterministic ones are. And in particular, there must be a language that is a context-free language that is not deterministic context-free, because every DCFL is already a CFL. And in fact, one example of this we can figure out all right away is if we look at the language 0 to the n, 1 to the n, I did that n wrong, 2 to the n, where n is at least 0. This guy was not context-free, but if I take the complement of it, we saw last time that the complement is context-free. So this tells us that this language, the complemented one, is not a DCFL, because if it were, then its complement would also be a DCFL, but the original language is not even context-free and not a DCFL automatically, because it's not even context-free, which includes DCFLs. So this language right here is not a DCFL. Okay, so there's no deterministic PDA for this. And it seems like that's kind of weird, because the language that's the complement is actually pretty simple, but it actually shows some really important things. It also shows that deterministic context-free languages are not closed under union in a different way, but I'm not going to go into that yet. Okay, so how would we actually show this? Well, one possible idea that you might have is, well, these things are deterministic. Why don't we just do the same thing we did with DFAs, which is we swap the final and non-final states. So an idea is to swap the final and non-final states. And that seems totally reasonable. But the problem is, what if we have a transition that's like this? So let's say we have two states, Q and Q prime here. And in the DPDA, we have this transition. So notably that this can be the only transition coming out of Q here, but that's beside the point. For example, what if Q prime was an accept state and Q was not an accept state? Then if we do the flip-flop of which states were final and not, then in the complemented one, we would have that Q is a final state and Q prime isn't a final state, it's just normal state. But if we had a string that ended up in this state right here, then I can take this transition over to here without reading anything, without consuming more input. And in the complemented machine, if we didn't do anything with the transitions, then I could just stay in the Q state, the accepted version of it. And so in both cases, we would accept the string. So that would imply that that string is in the language and in the complement of the language, which is just impossible for it to occur. So we would need to do something to the, not just swapping the final and non-final states, but we need to do something to the transitions, or maybe something else entirely to the DPDA. So another thing that can happen is something that we call a looping situation. So a looping situation occurs when you have something that's like this. So we have a bunch of states that have a bunch of transitions, like this, and each one of these, there's no read on any of these transitions. And it could be conceivable that if there's no read on any of these, we could just cycle around over and over and over and never actually read the whole input string. So remember, the criteria to accept a string is that it has to be in a final state to start with, and it needs to have been read in full. So if we fail to read the whole input, then we'll never accept the string, even if we are in a final state. So that could possibly happen. So another thing that can happen along these lines is if we have a state, let's say Q prime here, or maybe I'll make it double prime, and let's say that each transition coming out of Q prime only pops. Well, actually not only pops, I guess each one of these transitions pops. What if we enter this state right here and we have nothing on the stack whatsoever? Then if we try to take any of these transitions, then we try to pop an empty stack, which is just impossible. So we would actually get stuck in this state, and we would never actually possibly read the whole input string. So we actually could fail to read the input string by getting stuck and not being able to take a transition, or the opposite problem, we never get stuck. We would just keep going around and never actually accept the input string, or because we never actually read the whole thing. So we need to fix both of these problems first of all. So what we're going to do is we're going to ensure that the DPDA that we have, whatever it is, it can be any type of DPDA, reads the whole string. Whether it accepts or not, it has to read the whole thing. And then that will help make the complement final and non-final thing easier later. So let's say that we have a little DPDA right here. So here's the DPDA. And there's a start state, and maybe let's say it has these final states and maybe some other state that's not final. It's not really that important. So the way to fix the problem of being stuck is we'll put on some special symbol at the beginning, and if it ends up being the case that we will have to pop that special character in some intermediary state, then we will either immediately accept or immediately reject, or I guess not accept. So that's kind of a trick that we saw when we did the CFG to PDA conversion. We put some special symbol on the stack and then popped it off at the end. We're going to do something very similar here. So I'm going to make a brand new start state, which will have a epsilon transition of some kind going into the start state. This is okay for the DPDA perspective because every possible input character and stack character map to these ones. So I can take this transition no matter what, and there's no other transition I'm going to add here. So we're okay on the DPDA part. The part that's now not okay is that this character, the $, is a new stack character. And so all of these states are not working now in terms of the deterministic perspective because they don't have a transition necessarily that will involve the $. So what do we actually do here? So what I'm going to do is we're going to have two special states, Q accept down here, which is going to will be the only final state. It's not now, but it will be. And a state down here I'm going to call Q reject. And if you know what a Turing machine is, this is kind of similar, but we need to actually be able to read the whole thing. So what we're going to do is from only the accept states that are originally in the DPDA, we're going to have a transition from them to the accept state that involves popping the that special symbol, the $. So for example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an epsilon, $, goes to epsilon to pop the $, off. And this one right here is exactly the same. And for the ones that are not originally in accept state, they're going to be going over to the reject state right here. So so I'm going to do those in a different color. Let's say yellow. So this one's going to come over here, and it's going to be exactly the same transition. And this is okay from the deterministic perspective because this is the only transition that involves the $. And so I'm okay entirely by doing this. And this one will have exactly the same. I'm actually going to merge them together like that. So this is okay. Well, what about these two states down here? Well, we got to ensure that the entire input's read. So it might be the case that we have coming down here, and we haven't actually read the whole input. So what I'm going to do is, in the reject state, well, we might as well just read the whole thing in the reject state because we'll never accept at that point anyway. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a self loop which has all, actually I'm going to do it like this. So it's going to be A, epsilon, epsilon for all inputs A. I'm sure I can actually write inputs, all inputs A. So that will actually ensure that we actually do read the whole input because we're forced to take these transitions. Well, from the accept one, if we haven't read the whole thing by that point, then we need to reject, because if we try to go to the accept state and we try to go over to and we try to read something else, then we haven't really accepted from these other states' perspectives. So what I'm going to do here is very similar, but it's going to go over to the reject state. So it's going to be A, epsilon, epsilon for all inputs A, just like before. And I don't actually, I just realized you don't have to do this, but I'm going to make those guys no longer final. So it's not really that important, but the important thing is that we're forcing the string to be entirely read by putting this special character on and detecting whenever the stack is at that point. Then we'll go either to the accept state. And if we've read the whole thing, then we can just stop there, because if we've read the whole thing, I can't take any of these transitions going over the reject anyway. And if we haven't read the whole thing and we're in one of these other states and we try to pop the dollar sign, there's nothing left on the stack anymore. So I'm going to go over to the reject state and we're going to stay there and not accept, because we wouldn't have accepted anyway. Okay, so we've ensured that the input is entirely read. Now what we actually need to do is to set it up so that we can flip the final and non-final states. So what are we going to do here? So we're going to talk about something called a reading state. So a reading state is a state that kind of looks like this. So it's going to be a state queue. So this guy will be a reading state. Actually, the arrow should be this way. So the queue is going to be a reading state if there's a transition going from it to, say, Q prime, that will read something, let's say an A, and not pop anything. So it does not pop on this transition, and it could push anything, because pushing doesn't matter anything whatsoever on what the stack contents are, because I can always push things onto a stack. So we're going to say that that is in fact a reading state. So note that this is not popping anything. So it's purely reading. So it's only purely reading anything. So what if we had, let's say, Q going to Q prime, which is not a reading transition. So let's say it's A popping an X and pushing a Y. So it's not a reading state necessarily, because it's popping something right here, whereas the reading condition says it's not popping. So what we are going to do here is we're going to break this up into two transitions, kind of like how we, when we were converting the PDA to a CFG, we broke up the transitions that did both operations, push and pop, into two separate transitions, one which popped first and then pushed next. That's almost identical to what we're going to do here. So I have Q and Q prime here on both sides. I'm going to put a state Q double prime in the middle. And how this is going to work is I'm going to have an epsilon here and pop an X and not push anything, although the push doesn't actually matter here because, again, it doesn't matter what the stack contents were. But what I'm going to do here is the rest of what the transition needs to do, which in this case is it needs to do the read and do the push, because this one didn't do the push. So this one's going to read an A, not pop anything because we popped the X, we don't need to do any more, and then push the Y because we need to push a Y. So you note here, look at this, So there's no push on this state right, I'm sorry, no pop from this transition. So then what we'll say is that Q prime then is a reading state because of this transition right here, which is pretty cool. Okay, so the problem of whether, so we're actually very close now, believe it or not. So the only problem is if we have a transition, let's say from Q to Q double prime like this, where Q is a final state. Well then, what does Q double prime have to be? Q double prime has to also be a final state. Why? Because there's a non-reading transition going from one to the other. So if you have an epsilon transition from one to the other, then if the first one is a final state, then the second one must also be a final state, and vice versa. If the second one was final, then the first one had to be final. So what we'll say here is if Q is a final state, then we will have that Q double prime is a final state too. This does not imply anything about the Q prime state because we have a reading transition right here. Isn't that pretty cool? And what about any state that was final before? So let's say Q, actually I'll call it R, a different state. Let's say it was final before, and we have a bunch of transitions coming out. And let's say, for example, that none are reading transitions at all. Then what we'll do then, so there's no reading transitions whatsoever, then what we're going to do is we're going to remove R from F because it's not actually a reading state. Okay, so that's all that we actually need to do. Let me just check to be absolutely sure. Yeah, so any state that's not a reading state, we're going to remove it from the set of final states if it was there before. So this tells us that whenever you are actually reading something, if you're reading something and you enter a final state, you will not leave the final state, any final state, until you exit out by reading another symbol. So what the net result of this is that if we have a state here which does a read right here, and let's say that we enter a final state, it doesn't matter whether this one was final because this is a reading transition. Then if we have an epsilon transition here, we will stay in a final state. It could be a completely different final state, by the way. And then we're just going to keep going if we have a bunch of epsilon reading transitions. These could be popping, but that's not the point. Then we're just going to keep going. But then if we encounter a reading transition, then the state that we enter, this one is not required to be final. Okay, there's actually one thing that we need to fix first, which is I didn't actually ensure, because I forgot, to ensure that we read the whole string because of this looping situation thing. I forgot about that, sorry. So let's talk about the looping situation first. I mean last. So let's talk about this looping situation. So as I said before, a looping situation happens when you have a state and we have a bunch of epsilon transitions right here, and that go around in a circle like this. And let's say at this moment that we are in a state Q right here, and furthermore that the top symbol is X, let's say. Then we will say that this thing is a looping situation, namely the state and the symbol at the top is looping situation. If we can go around the cycle, so if we can go around this cycle, some cycle in the DPDA somewhere, it doesn't have to necessarily be here, and there could be multiple of these. If nothing red, if there's nothing that's red at all around the cycle, and we don't pop below this character X. So that means that once we go around, then the stack either is exactly the same height or it grows. And so therefore, we can just keep going around and around and around and around and never actually stop. So what we're going to do then is we're going to designate two different types of looping situations. So we'll say that this is accepting if some state is in F, and it's going to be rejecting otherwise. Yeah, what this means is that none of the states is the final state. So what do we do in these two situations? In this one, where some state was a final state, let's say this one, then what we'll do is we'll redirect from that state. So we'll redirect a transition, and let me check which one it actually is. So what we're going to do is we're going to, if this is the looping situation, actually I should designate it to be this state right here because we're talking about that state and that symbol. So what we'll do is we'll redirect from state Q, which is a final state. Let's say state Q is the final state here. Redirect from Q, popping X to that state Q accept. Because if it is an accept state, then we'll just redirect going to the accept state because Q is already an accept state. And what you can probably guess is that for the rejecting one, we'll redirect from Q popping X to Q reject. Because if there was no state that's final at all along the whole cycle, then if we just keep going around, we'll never accept anyway. So therefore, we can just go to state Q and just pop X to determine that that's the character that's on top, and we can go to the reject state. So how do you figure out what thing is a looping situation? You just go through all cycles in the DPDA from any state with any stack symbol, and you just determine whether there's a cycle of this form. And if there is, then what you do is you just change that one transition, and then you look again. Is there a looping situation? If no, then we're done. If yes, then just redirect the transition, and that's all you need to do. So, and then the final rabbit I'll pull out of my hat is that we can now swap final and non-final states. Because we'll never have that situation, well, so the entire input's red, but also we'll never have a situation of going from one state to another one without reading, and only one of the two is exactly one of the two is final. So either both are final or both are not final if there is an epsilon transition between the two. So that was showing that deterministic context-free languages are in fact closed under complement, which is pretty dang cool. So hopefully that was interesting. Leave your thoughts about deterministic context-free languages and this proof down in the comments below. As always, please like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out. There are many other links in the video description if you want to support the channel further. I'm currently doing one-on-one tutoring sessions, so if you want to schedule something, contact me. And as always, I'll see you next time.